Hi there. This video is going to be going over gerunds and gerundives, two important topics. Supines are also included in this presentation, but we're going to be skipping supines and handle them in a separate talk. Okay, so we're going to start with the gerundive. Okay, the gerundive is actually something that already has been learned because the gerundive is just another name for the future passive participle. This is the undus ending that you apply to the present stem. We also probably talked about it in periphrastic constructions, meaning constructions that use the verb to be in conjunction with a future passive participle to express obligation or necessity. So the famous example was Carthago delenda est, Carthage must be destroyed, which literally means something like Carthage is going to be destroyed. Carthage must be destroyed. So we've already talked about this topic. In fact, I have a flashback slide here that goes over the basics of how to form this thing. And so if you need a quick refresher on what this looks like, you can check here. But in reality, the most important thing to remember is that the gerundive is an adjective, and therefore it's going to agree with some noun in gender, number, and case. And so we're going to see that as we look at our future examples. But if you just need a quick refresher on how the gerundive works, how it's formed, all of that, you can see it here. It's a very simple form, pretty easy to spot because of the undus ending. It's going to be how it gets used in more complicated ways that are not the periphrastic constructions. It's going to be a little bit more complicated. Now, the gerund is one we have not technically learned, although we kind of have. The gerundive is formed, or sorry, the gerund is formed exactly like the gerundive. So it's the second principal part, the present stem, with undus added on to it. Except you'll see here that it says specifically we're only using undum, undi, undo, and we'll talk about why that is in a second. But the gerund is exactly the same as the gerundive formation-wise. While the gerundive was a verbal adjective, the gerund is a verbal noun. And it basically equates to, in English, when we use ing to make a verb into a noun. So run becomes running, or like the concept of running, the act of running. Gerundives were always passive, okay, because they were the future passive participle. Gerunds are always active, right? The concept of running is an active idea. The concept of killing, the concept of fighting, these are active ideas. They can be declined, but the gerund only exists in the neuter singular, which is why you see this very limited list of endings here, undum, undi, undo. It only exists in the neuter, which makes sense because the concept of running, right? The concept of verb is a neuter idea. And it only exists in the singular because you can't have the concept of runnings. It would kind of be redundant or unnecessary. Okay, so the gerund only exists in the neuter singular, and it is a noun. They can take objects, although this is usually very, very rare. So you could say like the concept of running a race or running a marathon. Theoretically, that could take an object, but generally we see a different construction used instead. And I have a later slide that explains that. The only other twist with the gerund is that it does not exist in the nominative. And the reason for that is if the Romans were going to use an English gerund as the subject of a sentence, so if you're going to say something like running is a sport many people enjoy, and you're going to use the gerund there, the Romans would not use the gerund for that construction. Instead, they would use a subjective infinitive, which is something that we learned in chapter 5 of Lingua Latina. So basically, here are some examples of a gerund in action, okay? And also a chance for you to see that you would not use the gerund for a nominative case use. So in the sentence, necare est malum, killing is evil, right? In English, this is a gerund, killing, okay? But in Latin, you would not write that. Instead, you would use a subjective infinitive. saying essentially in English, to kill is evil. So there's the subjective infinitive instead of the gerund. But here we have the gerund, nekandi, nekando, nekandum, nekando, right? Love of killing. Loving is dissimilar to killing because this adjective dissimiles requires a dative, so dissimilar to killing. I fear the killing or killing is the object of the verb timeo, and so we have the accusative of the gerund. And then by killing, ablative case, ablative of means here, with the gerund, nekando, right? In this one, we have a subjective infinitive and a gerund, but I just threw that in just so you can see the same construction here and here. So basically, if you want to turn a verb, kill, run, jump, swim, whatever, into a noun, you can do that by making it into a gerund. The only caveat to that is it must be neuter, it must be singular, and it is not going to exist in the nominative form. You're always going to see it in the other cases. One of the tricky things about this, though, is that killing, or this ing ending, right, it can look like a lot of different things. A subjective infinitive looks like ing, killing, right here. The gerund looks like killing. The present participle has ing. The present tense has ing. You could even say the imperfect tense, I was killing, right? So in English, anything that looks like ing is not always going to be a gerund, okay? But it is very, very safe for you to translate gerunds as ing words, because that's how in English we create gerunds out of verbs. We take a word like love and turn it into loving. Take a word like kill, turning it into killing. Now, one of the big questions that is asked for the AP class is this word that you're looking at a gerund or a gerundive? And the reason is because they look very similar, right? In terms of formation, they both use the same construction. Present stem plus plus undus aum, or undum aum, or undum io neuter endings. Okay. The key is to tell the difference is that the gerundive is an adjective, and therefore it's always going to be modifying another noun. If it's not modifying another noun, if it's standing on its own, then it's probably a gerund. You can also decide whether something's a gerund or a gerundive by looking at the gender. If the gender of the word in question is feminine, then it automatically has to be a gerundive, because gerundives are adjectives, whereas gerunds have to be neuter nouns. Same thing if you can 100% guarantee that a gerund or gerundive word is masculine, then it automatically has to be a gerundive, because only the gerundive can exist in the masculine and feminine. If it's plural, it's automatically a gerundive, because again, gerunds are only singular. The final way that you can tell the difference is gerunds are always active and gerundives are always passive. So if you're looking at a word and you've identified it in English as being translated a certain way, actively or passively, then you can decide whether or not that thing is a gerund or a gerundive based on that. Now, the main way that you've learned how to use gerunds and gerundives is from the periphrastic constructions that express obligation with the dative of agent. And that is the passive periphrastic used with the future passive participle, which is also known as the gerundive. So this is a slide that kind of goes into that before, but this is something that was learned previously. The new thing to pay attention to, the new concept that we need to know, is that generally in Latin, when you see a gerundive being used in real Latin, you very often need to perform what some educators call a gerund-gerundive flip. And that is, you're going to take a gerundive in Latin and change it into an English gerund, because the English gerund sounds better than using the English gerundive expression, which can be very clunky. The Romans preferred to use the gerundive, so they often will write using gerundives. But in English, we would prefer the gerund. So we have to do a little bit of reverse engineering here to fix this to make it sound better in English. So here's an example. Pluto cupidus puellae seducendi. Okay, Pluto, desirous of the girl going to be led away. Okay? That's what this literally says. If you translate this word for word, that's exactly what this thing says. Okay, Pluto, desirous of the girl going to be led away, and then the rest of the sentence would continue on after that. Right? What this is trying to say is Pluto wants to take this girl away. We in English would use that expression. We would say desirous of taking away the girl. That's what we have down here, right? This would sound more like what we would say in English. But the Latin doesn't read that way. The Latin doesn't use a gerund. It doesn't say seducendum and then puella, whatever, or seducendi and then puellas. Instead, it makes desirous of the girl, and then it uses a gerundive to modify that girl. So in English, to fix this, to render this properly, okay, the way that we fix it is by taking this word that is a gerundive and treating it like a gerund in English. So changing going to be led away into taking away, leading away, making it a gerund in English. And then the word that gerundive was modifying, puellae, girl, becomes the object of that gerund. Okay, because that's the way that we would normally write this in English. So here's some other examples of this. Desirous of the city going to be seen. Well, what this is really trying to say is that whoever this adjective desirous is modifying, that adjective is saying that they want to do this. They want to see the city. So instead, we take what was a gerundive in Latin, videndi, going to be seen, make it into a gerund of seeing, okay, and then make this word that was originally being modified by the gerundive into the object of that gerund. So desirous of the city going to be seen becomes desirous of seeing the city. That's the more effective way to translate it. Okay. Here we have love of enemies going to be fought. Love of enemies going to be fought. What that really is trying to say is that whoever had, this is a love of fighting enemies. Okay, love of fighting enemies. So the way that we fix this to make it sound more like what we are trying to get it to express in English is we take the gerundive, we flip it into an English gerund. So going to be fought becomes of fighting. And then the enemies becomes the object of that gerund. Now you might say, why are we saying of seeing or of fighting? Why are the new gerunds in the genitive? Because the original constructions were in the genitive. Videndi and pugnandorum. Okay, these are genitive expressions. If this was dative or if this was whatever, we would use those instead. But here we have genitives, so we're going to do that. Latin can technically do this. Latin could theoretically have the same expression, right? So desirous of seeing the city. That's what this expression is trying to say. Latin could theoretically write this, desirous of seeing, and then having the city in the accusative, okay? Or love of fighting the enemies. Latin can write this the same way that we literally in English would say it. But the Romans didn't prefer that expression. They much rather, if they were ever were going to write this, what they would do instead is change it so that you now, instead of have a gerund in the case that you want it to be, desirous of seeing, you say desirous, and then whatever the thing is, in this case, the city, put that into the new case that you need, you're expecting, the genitive, and then have a gerundive modify this. So it's difficult because this is technically possible in Latin, but it's not something that would actually occur. Whereas it would be great because that's exactly the way that we think in English. But in Latin, this is what they would prefer to write. They would prefer to use a gerundive expression. So instead, if you see a gerundive expression like this, and it's not in a periphrastic expression, then what you need to do is do a gerund-gerundive flip and change it into an English gerund. That's one element of using gerunds and gerundives. The other big thing that we see with gerunds and gerundives is that they can express purpose. And this is arguably even more important than what was just said about the gerund-gerundive flip. They use gerunds and gerundives to express purpose very commonly in Latin. Now, thankfully, it's still the same process. It's just that you have to be on the lookout for certain words or expressions. Okay? So the way that the Romans would do this is they would write a sentence and then they would use either the word causa or gratia to mean something like for the sake of, okay? And they would still use the same expression, a noun, which now has a gerundive attached to it, okay? So I fight for the sake of the city going to be saved. I fight for the sake of the city going to be saved. Or I fight for the sake of living, okay? This is very easy to tell that its purpose. I fight for the sake of living means I fight to live, okay? Here, though, it's weird to say I fight to of city going to be saved. If you try to do it literally and make it purpose, it doesn't sound quite right. So instead, what you have to do is a bit of a gerund gerundive flip. Take this gerundive and make it into an English gerund, right? Fighting. I fight for the sake of preserving the city. Make that into the object of the original gerundive. Okay? That's causa or gratia plus the genitive. Okay, so you can see genitive, genitive, genitive. Here you can have accusative with the preposition odd and sometimes in, although rarely. I fight to city going to be saved. I fight to make this a gerundive, save, or I fight for it saving the city. Okay. This is actually a little bit easier because odd already means to in a different sense, to in the directional sense. So basically, as long as you say I fight to, and then you see this expression, you generally can realize, okay, this is a gerundive, something strange is going on, and I need to make this purpose. But these are the two ways that gerunds and gerundives are used to express purpose. With these words, causa or gratia, plus the genitive, or with odd and sometimes in, plus the accusative. But as long as you can remember the gerund gerundive flip strategy, you can generally find these things pretty easy to deal with. That's it for gerunds and gerundives. We will see plenty of examples of these in actual Latin stuff that we read, but that's it.